In studying the war in Afghanistan, obviously one of the first places we want to look at is 9/11 and the events of 9/11 and how those events were explained. And to do that, to focus on something that was so shocking to the American consciousness, we have to go back and look at how these events were portrayed to people. What could be this possible explanation for suicide terrorism in general? What is suicide terrorism? Where does it come from? Is there a reason for suicide terrorism that makes sense, or is it just a random act of violence? To remember some of these things, let's look to George Bush's explanation of suicide terrorism with regard to 9/11 as the justification for the Afghanistan war. And this became sort of a famous line that he is known for after this statement before a joint session of Congress on the war on terror.
Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. They want to overthrow existing governments in many Muslim countries, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. They want to drive Israel out of the Middle East. They want to drive Christians and Jews out of vast regions of Asia and Africa. These terrorists kill not merely to end lives, but to disrupt and end a way of life. With every atrocity, they hope that America grows fearful, retreating from the world and forsaking our friends.
We'll pause it there. So the famous line, of course, is they hate us for our freedoms. And no doubt that there is some truth to that. There is some surface validity to that, at the very least. Osama bin Laden and others who follow that ideology of radical Islamic fundamentalism, and the people like the Shah of Iran and other people did criticize Western democracy and Western liberalism and Western culture and Western capitalism and all these things. However, that isn't necessarily enough to get people to kill or die for a cause, for those abstract principles. Rarely do people fight in wars or take lives or willing to sacrifice their own life for such abstract principles. And it's interesting, I hadn't paid attention to this until just now, but it's interesting to think of, to hear again these words from George W. Bush talking about that they want to overthrow existing governments. No doubt that is true. Osama bin Laden, that was part of his strategy, as we'll look at in another video in the future, of what his goal was to try to overthrow governments in order to gain a foothold for his power in that region. That being said, the governments he mentions, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and others that are American allies, it seems a little bit hypocritical at the very least to talk about that they want to overthrow governments, yet at the same time, the United States government has been complicit in actively, covertly, sometimes with the CIA and other, or overtly with regime change measures like Afghanistan and Iraq, overthrowing an existing government and then trying to replace it with something. But anyway, that's a point for another video. But let's look to where does suicide terrorism come from? There had to be some explanation for suicide terrorism. Let me see if I can move this video. Okay. There had to be some sort of explanation for suicide terrorism because most of Americans, until 9/11, they had some awareness of it, but it didn't have the place in our consciousness that it did after 9/11. There had to be some sort of account for this shocking event that now took place that was so traumatic in the minds of Americans and is unique in American history. And unfortunately, for most Americans, there's kind of a tendency, at least internationally, to have a myopic or a limited view of history. And for most Americans, it was said by, I believe it's Harry Brown, that history began on 9/11. In other words, attention was not paid from World War II through the Cold War, through the 70s forward to all that's going on internationally in the Middle East, in that region of the Arabian Peninsula. And it's not really an American historical consciousness, how the involvement of the American government and the CIA and all those entities in that region. So, what could explain this shocking and violent tragedy like 9/11 and subsequent terrorism, suicide terrorism? What explanation was given? Well, George W. Bush, that was his explanation. They hate us for our freedoms, and they're animated by and blinded by a radical religious ideology, Islamic fundamentalism. And Islamic fundamentalism, taken to this extreme, causes people to become terrorists. And so that's what we see is Muslims who hate Western style liberal democracy, hate capitalism. That's the explanation that was given to us. But the truth is, people rarely fight for those abstract principles and are willing to die for them. Could there be more tangible reasons? And another question that is often overlooked, and the answer would be probably surprising given what we're told or what is repeated in media, is do Muslims, driven by Islamic fundamentalism, account for the greatest number of suicide terror attacks? It's an important question. It's a very basic question to be asked. Are most suicide terror attacks perpetrated by Muslims following radical Islamic ideology? And that's what causes them to be terrorists. And there are other explanations of terrorists that they are uh, poor, that they're low socioeconomic status, that they don't have much going on for them. But we also see that that's not necessarily true. A lot of these uh, terrorists are educated, are fairly wealthy, are westernized. They have connections to the Arabian Peninsula or states in that region and family in that region, but live in the West. So is that, and that's just Islamic terrorism. So what can explain these things? Well, one study that was, I think, should be applauded and talked about more for its just simplicity and its methodology and its definitive work in the study of terrorism in general is the work by political science professor Robert Pape. And he's written a book on this called Dying to Win. And he's also written a paper that can easily be found online called The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism. And what he found, some of his findings I'll summarize, that terrorist organizations are increasing and they were using suicide terror attacks in order to gain major political objectives. So suicide terrorism is not random. It has a logic to it. It has specific political goals that are in mind, and they see that it works. It does influence Western liberal democracies to specific political actions, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But his methodology, Robert Pape and his team, is fairly simple. He looked at terrorist attacks over time, counted them up, and then looked at what the explanations were, either that the person stated or the group stated or whatever the case may be, of what their reason was for suicide terrorism. And then pulling that data together, he drew some common themes of what causes suicide terrorism. And so it's pretty simple. You just counted the suicide terror attacks since 1970. There's always been some form of suicide terrorism, but we're thinking of it in the more modern sense. So his research demonstrates that the rate has increased from 31 suicide terror attacks in the 1980s. It went up to 104 suicide terror attacks in the 1990s, and then 53 attacks just between 2000 and 2001 alone. So there is this increase of suicide terror attacks. The number of total incidents of suicide terror from from a low of 1987 was 274 worldwide. Uh, Actually in 1998. So suicide terrorism, had been coming down from 1987 to a low of 274 suicide terror attacks in 1998 worldwide, but then shoots way up. 348 suicide terrorist attacks in 2001 alone. And then his research continued. What explains this trend in suicide terrorism? Is Islamic uh, radical Islam, Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic extremism, whatever we call it under those various names, is that enough to justify this attack in suicide terror? He writes, let me quote from Pape. Although religious motives may matter, modern suicide terrorism is not limited to Islamic fundamentalism. Islamic groups receive the most attention in Western media, but the world's leader in suicide terrorism is actually the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, a group who recruits from predominantly Hindu Tamil population in northern and eastern Sri Lanka, and whose ideology has Marxist-Leninist elements. The LTTE, or the Tamil Tigers, alone accounts for 75 of the 186 suicide terrorist attacks from 1980 to 2001. Even Islamic suicide attacks groups with secular orientation account for about 1/3 of these attacks. So what he's saying is the greatest number of suicide terror attacks, or the greatest perpetrator until recently of suicide terror, was this group in Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers, and they're not traditionally religious at all. They're actually more atheistic. They follow an atheistic Marxist ideology. Why has suicide terrorism risen dramatically, though, among Muslim populations? Robert Pape draws down this paper to one basic demonstrable quantitative conclusion, and that the greatest indicator or predictor of suicide terrorism is when a country is occupied by foreign occupation. Meaning this: when a country or countries or a region like the Arabian Peninsula are occupied by a foreign military like the United States or others, what you're going to see more likely from that region, that group of states, that people, is you're going to see a rise in suicide terrorism. And so that explains powerfully and predictably suicide terror. So apart from the impression of Western media that Muslims make up these suicide terror attacks just because of radical Islamic ideology, it's more that radical Islamic ideology provides a basis or a bringing together a common identity for response against what they feel is foreign occupation. So that's the reason why in the occupation of these majority Muslim areas in the Arabian Peninsula, we see a rise in Islamic terror. So following the September 11th attacks, a poll was conducted that found that 95% of educated Saudi males, and so Saudi Arabia is that key area of the Arabian Peninsula, and Saudi Arabia, even though it is a sponsor of terror, commits these theocratic uh, atrocities against its own people and against Americans, all these things. It is an official American ally, but 95% of these Saudi males between 25 and 41 agreed with the goal of Osama bin Laden to drive American presence from the Arabian Peninsula. Meaning this, most Muslims in the Arabian Peninsula, had they been asked, do you agree with Osama bin Laden and his tactics of suicide terrorism? Most of them probably would have said no. But it is very telling that when they are asked, do you agree that the American government and the American bases and the American occupation and American power should be driven out of the peninsula, even if you don't agree with the methods of bin Laden and other radical Islamic extremists? Their answer is actually yes, because they see the United States government as foreign occupiers who do not speak their language, who do not share their religion, who do not understand or know their culture or laws, and who come in to their region. So they don't agree. And it doesn't mean that all the people who agreed or those males surveyed, the 95% of Saudi males between that age group, would become terrorists or are terrorists in seed form. It means that because of that occupation, that it allows for a sympathy toward those more radical views. And terrorism, suicide terrorism, is being shown to work because it does influence liberal democracies to take specific political actions. And those can be read about in paper. Now, Osama bin Laden, uh, Zawahiri, uh, the Shah of Iran for years had been criticizing American culture, values, and that wasn't enough to get people, or a lot of people, to be driven into suicide terrorism, to be willing to kill or die for the United States. So they changed their tactic. Bin Laden and others started focusing on real, tangible issues that were political things that you could say that they were achieved or not achieved, and tangible offenses of the United States government, real political grievances, and people will fight for those things. And so, one was they mentioned the US support for dictatorships in the Middle East as a justification for suicide terrorism. That was a real, tangible offense that would make some sympathetic to the messaging of suicide terrorism might work to solve this problem that the US has supported uh, at odds with its own creed and its own ideology of liberty and freedom and justice, has supported these dictatorships. Um, One question to ask is, why did the 9/11 hijackers come from Syria, or none of them actually came from Syria, Iran, or Iraq? These are our designated enemy states, right? Bush put Iran and Iraq, two out of the three, and then threw in North Korea as the new axis of evil. Syria is a designated enemy state. Why did then none of the suicide terrorists in the 9/11 attacks come from those countries? These are our supposed designated enemy states. But the attackers came from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, states where they're officially American allies, but military occupations and support for dictatorships from the United States has been the norm. And so the rationale for suicide terrorism that Americans have been given and have largely believed is as simple as they hate us for our freedoms. But that's not necessarily the case, and that can be seen in many things. In fact, that many Muslims come to the West to get educated. They have appreciation for things of the West. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't more conservative Islamic followers who do hate the uh, Westernness of the United States and those things. But that doesn't mean that's enough to get Muslims animated to and sympathetic to suicide terrorism. Uh, so Osama bin Laden changed his messaging and focused in on those tangible things that were real political goals. So, like it or not, his messaging was more compelling in that way. And that will help us understand better suicide terrorism, the nature and causes of suicide terrorism, as we continue to look at the war of Afghanistan and the invasion of Afghanistan.